I was like, yeah, the frozen chosen from last week to this week. But thank you for actually, this is not a bad size Bible class. So thank you for coming, and I'm excited about getting started in Genesis. Well, Lee already started with his overview and his synopsis, I guess you could say. But today we're going to begin in Genesis 1. But we're not just going to dig right into the text. I still think there's some groundwork that we can lay. And I'm going to be using terms that, if you haven't already heard these terms, I kind of want to be descriptive of these terms so that way, or define them, so that way you'll know, so you won't get lost and know what we're talking about. One of the terms is ancient Near East. It's a scholarly term, and it just refers to the region of the Near East. So that the ancient Near East. So that would be like Asia Minor, Mesopotamia. Basically, draw kind of a crescent around the easternmost region of the Mediterranean. That would be the Eastern Near East, or ancient Near East. And it would refer essentially to the first civilizations that we know about. So that would include like Egypt, Babylonia, actually even before Babylon, it would be the Chaldeans and the Akkadians, Hittites, Sumerians, ancient Israel. So ancient Near East. And sometimes if you love history as much as I do, which you may not, but that's fine. Hopefully this class will give you at least an appreciation for it. It will often be abbreviated as ANE. So if you're reading a document or you're reading an article and they say ANE sources often say blah blah blah, and you're like, ANE, what's ANE? It's ancient Near East, okay? And the reason why I wanted to bring up this term is because whenever you're studying Genesis, as a Christian, you're going to encounter a lot of other opinions about Genesis, all right? You're going to encounter people who believe that it is merely myth, and they use those terms. They use those two words very. They always use them together. Merely myth, as if it doesn't have anything to say to us any more than a Hansel and Gretel or some other kind of fairy tale. They view it as a fairy tale, something that is pretty much useless to be dispensed with, doesn't really hold any value. So that's kind of one extreme perspective. That would be like the extreme secular or extreme atheist perspective about Genesis. And then you have some literary critics, which critics doesn't necessarily mean that they criticize. It just means that they're being critical in their analysis of texts, which would include the Genesis text. Some scholars say that, so we'll say there's the skeptic / mythological. They believe it's mythological only. Mythological. Is that right? Mythological. Man, it's weird spelling things up close. It doesn't look right. Mythological. The skeptical mythological. That would be, your, like I said, primarily atheistic perspective. They don't believe this is, anything more than old wives' tales. And then you have the literary polemic perspective. Literary polemic perspective, which there's a lot of scholars hold to, which is, now what do you think literary polemic would refer to? Polemic, two things in opposition to each other. Yeah, they would often hold to the perspective that it was an attempt at refuting and being a polemic to the other ancient Near Eastern perspectives of the region. So, like all the other ancient Near Eastern religions were all polytheistic. So this was a polemic, a monotheistic polemic against that. So there are actually biblical scholars that are Christians that hold to this perspective. They say that that it's meant to refute ancient Near Eastern creation mythologies, especially the beginning part of Genesis. Say the first 6 chapters or so. It's meant to be a polemic against all the others. I actually think there's some validity to this perspective. I do think that was part of the intent. I don't think it was the only intent, but I think it was a part of it. I think God is making a point throughout Genesis, especially the beginning of Genesis, like I said, the first 6 chapters or so. He's making a point to say, I am God, not these other gods. So that's part of it. Others say that the that the Genesis 1, specifically the Genesis 1 creation count, is radically different, and that the similarities are simply coincidental. So I would say that I don't know if that's really its own thing, but that I'm going to put up there. But some say that, and then some advance that the creation accounts of Babylon have influenced the narratives of the Gospels, and Matthew and Mark, as well as Paul's account of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians. That's kind of an outlier. But all this to say that, and then I would say, there would be the literal interpretation. Now, literal interpretation, which does not necessarily mean that we're analyzing it like a scientific book, all right? This is not a scientific perspective, but what this perspective, which is what I think, this is kind of the Orthodox Christian, Orthodox meaning right teaching, Christian perspective, I think, that most Christians throughout history have held about Genesis, is that insofar that it does speak about anything scientific, it is true. Insofar as it talks about history, makes historical claims, it is true. Insofar that it makes allegorical, claims, they are true. And anytime it talks about human nature and our own relationship or broken relationship with God, it is true. So I would just say that I would just summarize this literal interpretation as Genesis is reliable. And there are some people in the literary polemic that do hold to this as well. And then there's also skeptics that hold to the literary polemic, where they're just like, oh, this is just another text in the whole of the Near Eastern text that is just being a polemic. And then there's some who hold to the literal interpretation who also say, well, and it's a literary polemic. So I'm not trying to make these out as like distinct worldviews. I'm just trying to say these are just slightly different perspectives. Well, radically different in this case, but these are just different nuances to it. So Genesis is reliable. Reliable. Is that right? Reliable? Yeah, reliable. Genesis is reliable. Oh, there's no what? A. Oh. Reliable. Literary. E. I knew it didn't look right. There you go. Yeah, exactly. Like I said, it's weird drawing on a board. Yeah, there you go. So what is the context, before we dig in to the verses, So what is the context of Genesis being written? I think Lee already talked about this a little bit, but he was having to go at a pretty fast pace. So what is the context? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Moses wrote the book of Genesis after the Israelites had left Egypt while they were in the wilderness. So this actually makes the Genesis ancient Near Eastern account, to use that phrase, of creation pretty unique. We actually know who wrote it. So a lot of the other ancient Near Eastern sources, like from Babylon, from Akkadian, and et cetera, Canaanite, we don't know who originated those stories. We don't know who originally crafted them. We think, historians think that they may have just kind of originated as distinct myths that were maybe centered around a real life person at one point and then morphed over time or something like that. And like the Gilgamesh epic, etc. He may have been a real human being called Gilgamesh, who was maybe a patriarch or something, and then just over time it became mythological and just things added to it, to that story. But so that's the context, and it makes it unique in that we know who wrote it. Now there is some, again, among the literary critics, there's some people who think that Moses wrote part of it, and then there was this later P source. This is what they call a P source, like a secondary writer who was later during like the Babylonian captivity who edited it and added things to it. But I don't think that really holds much merit. I think there's a lot of speculation, and you have to be careful whenever you're studying any kind of literary criticism or anything like that, because there's a lot of speculation, and it often goes off of pretty subjective interpretations of things. Like for instance, Genesis 1 is one creation account, and then Genesis 2 is a separate creation account. Therefore, there's two separate authors. Or it's actually just a broader perspective and a more, concise perspective that Moses is giving, just using a different style both times. Just like you can say, I went to the store one day and I had to, and I got all the groceries I needed. That's an overview. And then you can be like, while I was at the store, I got this, and that's a more detailed view. They're both telling the same story, just from a slightly different frame of reference, right? So anyways, so that's the context. Moses was revealing to Israel what kind of God was forming them into a nation. So that's one of the things I wanted for us to think about as we go through Genesis, as we go through creation account, as we go through the creation of man, his subsequent fall, the Tower of Babel, etc. This is a story, yes, about people and about creation, but actually it's a story about God. God is actually revealing his attributes and his character to us through this story. And as we will see, as we compare this story of the story, especially in creation, like I said, the beginning of Genesis, to the stories of the contemporary creation myths around them, the God of Israel stands distinct. There are many people today, many skeptics and scoffers who say that the God of Israel was just, was a Canaanite God that the Israelites kind of adopted and then kind of made their own and added things to, and he was just this kind of hybrid of a lot of different perspectives that eventually became a monotheistic God. That's not the case. Like a true open-minded analysis of the gods of the day compared to Yahweh, there is no parallel. There's no parallel to his attributes and his power and the claims he makes about himself. The other ancient Near Eastern mythologies, the gods are capricious. They're very human. They even work and they do like manual labor, and then they have to create human beings to do the manual labor for them. And they're very human-centric gods. They have sex with one another. They do all these different things. But the God of the Bible in Genesis is distinct, and he is spirit and only spirit in Genesis. So let's see here. Let's go into the content. So Genesis 1. He blesses humanity to be fruitful and multiply, and he called all he created very good. On day 7, God completed his creation, ceased from his work, and consecrated the seventh day, as we'll see. While most exegetical studies of the Israelite creation account focus on the sequence of creation, the structure of Genesis 1 must also be examined. Genesis 1:1 is a summary statement of creation. So let's go ahead and start reading. Somebody, you can probably quote it off the top of your head. What is Genesis 1:1? What does it say? Yes. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It is a summary statement of creation. So he's establishing right off the bat, Moses is establishing right off the bat that God created everything. Because remember, in the ancient Near Eastern mind, the heavens and the earth, that encapsulates all of the cosmos. That encapsulates all of creation. So he's saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This is the main clause or title, essentially. You can think of it as a title for the chapter. So,
I like to look at the first 4 words as the thesis for being everything we believe. In the beginning, God.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't believe that,
Yep.
you're in the rest of the book.
Yep. Exactly. No, it is foundational. And that's why I think God, when he inspired Moses to write this, it's kind of like, remember, what's this musical? The Sound of Music. Let's start in the very beginning. It's a very good place to start, And let's start in the beginning because it is foundational. If we don't understand this, and this is why we're studying, and thank you for bringing that up, this is why we're studying Genesis, because it is foundational to our faith. If the foundations be destroyed, right, as God says, then the people perish, right? So I will contend that because our society, our civilization, does not properly understand this, all else flows from that. Because we don't properly understand this, where we come from as human beings, who we are in relation to God, who God is, why we are the way we are, what happened to us. If we don't understand those questions and can't answer those questions, then all else flows from that foundation. So a people that believe that they are created beings act differently, behave differently than people who believe that they were not created, but instead create themselves. And I don't think it takes a lot of extrapolation from that for us to realize a lot of the lies in our culture today about people creating themselves, right? Making themselves whatever they want to be. It stems from a misunderstanding of our proper relationship to God. Yeah.
Yeah, I would take that one step further and just say a people that doesn't acknowledge an authority larger than themselves.
Yeah.
Because that's what those first 4 words are doing. Is they're saying there is an ultimate authority above us.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
that's the critical difference.
Absolutely.
You act differently when you believe there is an authority greater than you.
Yes.
So you're responsible.
Yes. Yes.
Through,
So, yeah.
excuse me, but
Mm-hmm.
it is important to me when I read in verse 1 there. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period. Basically. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would shut down a lot of arguments,
Yeah.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that we maybe don't always key in on. But that's a complete statement.
Yeah, it is. It is a complete statement. And that's why I said it's a summary statement. It summarizes the rest of this chapter in that very first verse. Now, he goes on to explain kind of the means by which God did this in some ways, and kind of uses language that the people of the day would understand to communicate that truth. But it is a truth. So we see in the very beginning that the earth, in verse 2, earth was without form and void or empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So the earth was formless and void. I think it's hard for us to really comprehend what that means. That means so God created the heavens and the earth, all matter, the cosmos are created, right? But there's nothing formed yet. It's just matter. And he says, darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water. This verse contains 3 clauses that are descriptive and supply background information. The circumstances of the earth before creation. The state of chaos reveals that the earth is without shape, without light, and is present with God. So this structure is vital to a correct understanding of the Israelite creation account compared to ancient Near Eastern accounts. Because in Genesis 1, God creates from something. At first, he creates from nothing. But then once all the things are formed, he creates from something and he forms it. Let's see here. Let's skip ahead a little bit. So God created earth by divine fiat, by mere command. So, and ex nihilo, that's a Latin term meaning from nothing. In this manner of creation, there was no cosmic struggle. And why is this important? There was no cosmic struggle between God and chaos. He created all the structure, all the matter, all the time, the space, the space-time continuum, all those things, light, that would come a little bit later, but all the very structures of the universe, all the basic building blocks, if you will, the laws of the universe, he created from nothing. That is distinct from the other creation accounts of the ancient Near East. Almost every single one of them start with the gods or a god struggling with a force of primeval chaos, whether a giant serpent that they're struggling with and they have to kill, and then from the serpent's body came the earth, or there's some kind of cosmic struggle, or the gods are fighting each other, or they can get kind of crass, like there's sexual acts that happen, there's masturbation that happens, or something like that happens, and a god spontaneously creates something, sometimes by accident, it's not even intentional, like human beings sometimes just are like an accidental creation, or other times there's like 7 human beings created or something. So in this account, God is asserting that he did it by divine fiat, so by mere command, and ex nihilo, from nothing. There was no cosmic struggle between God and something else. In the Israelite creation account, God is the subject of the creative acts. seen in Genesis 1, 1, 3, 6, 9, etc., and continuing. He is the single supreme deity in the Israelite creation account. Not only is he the only God, but he existed before creation and outside of that creation. So that is actually another feature that is unique from other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. Other Near Eastern creation accounts presuppose a universe that already existed in many cases, or a primordial universe that was maybe raw, but then the gods acted upon it. Or, like I said, there was some cosmic struggle that happened. But a lot of the other ones presuppose that the universe has always been and always will be. Okay? The Israelite creation account actually says, no, there was a beginning. There was nothing except God for all eternity. God is the only eternal thing. And that is unique. He existed before creation and outside of that creation. Again, a lot of the other creation accounts, they kind of focus in on, the gods interacting with the world or in the world. And they are bound by things like time and sometimes even aging. Sometimes the gods are not actually immortal. Sometimes the gods actually do die permanently. But that is not what the Israelite account says, that he is before and outside creation. In the Israelite creation account, God does not use matter or human beings to create. Instead, he creates the matter by which he uses to create human beings. Instead, Genesis 1, Psalm 33, 6 through 9, and Romans 4, 14 all affirm that God merely spoke and creation emerged. So let's turn to Psalm 33. We'll see this, because there's some people that say that the Bible contradicts itself, or it doesn't, or there's these different accounts and et cetera, or whatever. But if you actually look throughout the whole entirety of the Bible, the amount of times that it cross-references and refers to things that have already been said or claimed is remarkable. And here, I'm having trouble finding Psalm 33 here. There we go. Psalm 33, 6 through 9 says, "By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea together as a heap. He laid up the depth in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast." So here's that Psalm 33. Psalm 33, 6 through 9. So here again, there's that divine fiat.
Oh, 6 through 9.
6 through 9.
I said 69.
No, 6 through 9. 6 through 9. Yeah. So why do you think it's so important? Why do you think it's important that God would create by his own word, just from his word alone? Why is that an important concept? Both today, certainly, but also for the ancient Near Eastern mind. Why would that be an important concept? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's unimaginable power. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. John 1. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Yeah, Doug?
Well, and also it's a testament to the completeness of, in the events of in the beginning, and then he goes down through the progression of the light, darkness, animal life, plant life,
Mm-hmm.
human life. All of that is distinct as complete. And a lot of, especially picking into the ones that were something more evolving.
Mm-hmm.
I've always said for someone that believes in evolution, that's kind of strange that we don't have cavemen running around.
Mm-hmm.
Did everything evolve at the same time? I mean, the evolution or the evolving rather than a complete creation
Yeah.
would not
That's
be completed
actually,
as unique. I mean, it's
yeah.
Man was man, he wasn't an ape, because
Mm-hmm.
those progressions should still exist.
Yeah, that's actually important. That is an important point. Is I like the way you put it, the completeness of it. That God created, and it was so. He did not create and then just watched as things just developed as they did. He didn't just create something and then let it develop and then just hands off, right? He was intimately involved in it. Yeah.
So by the time Moses is writing, there is a plethora of other gods,
Mm-hmm.
probably not countable.
Yeah.
And so anybody that believed in those other gods, if this record appears, it immediately indicates, based on what you said, that they weren't like God in the sense there was nothing.
Mm-hmm.
That God, if they were even true, that God would have created them.
Mm-hmm.
Like He is
Mm-hmm.
the monotheistic,
Supreme.
ultimate creator.
Yeah. And I think that, oh yeah.
I would just want to connect that to that point, and actually all that's been said. I don't think you can extricate ex nihilo from scope. I think there wasn't anything else. His command, his ability, his power, who he is, that was the only thing that could be.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody else? Well, I think, Dad, you kind of touched on it, and that is the distinction between God and man and God and the other gods of the day. The separateness, the separation between God and man, the distinction between those.
Well, and he continues to reaffirm it. I know Lee mentioned the Dagon statue.
Yeah.
I always forget, who's the prophet that did the fire with the water?
Elijah.
It's throughout the story of the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
God continues to affirm
Mm-hmm.
those other gods.
Yeah, there's a continuity to this, right? To this story that starts with the God above and beyond the universe, creating it, and then subsequently throughout all of human history being involved. Not being this deistic God, like deism believes that God is basically like a clockmaker. He just wound up the universe, created it, and then set it off to do what it would, and doesn't really interact anymore. That is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is intimately involved in his creation. All things are upheld through Christ, it says, through the power of his word. So, and that is affirmed numerous times throughout the scriptures. So, man, I'm looking at my sermon notes. And they put them behind the, confusing me.
One thing that Moses wrote this and how he's influenced by, or could have been influenced by things. Well, he would have written this probably while they were wandering.
Yeah, it was in the wilderness period, yeah.
After he's already been and lived with his father-in-law, who was
Mm-hmm.
a Midianite priest, and they were polytheistic, and so he would have had that influence of some sort, and that didn't trickle into this.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
So it adds more validity to this being, spirit breathing.
Right.
Well, it is Egyptian upbringing.
Yeah, it's Egyptian upbringing. I mean, just all the gods. Egyptology is I'll confess, it's actually too much for me. I've tried to kind of study it, and all the names and everything just start to merge together, and I'm like, wait, is that a pharaoh or is that a god or what? There are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of Egyptian gods, major and minor gods. anything from a god of papyrus, a god of, ripples on the Nile. Not the Nile, he's just the god of the currents of the Nile. I mean, it's just like they had so many gods. They're so polytheistic and relativistic in their perspective about the spiritual realm. They were not, they were actually pretty welcoming. Most pagans were actually pretty welcoming to the concept of, oh yeah, you've got your God, I've got my God. Your God commands one thing, my God commands another. It's like just live and let live kind of perspective, at least during times of peace. And then during times of war, it's like, your God's inferior to my God, I'm going to destroy you. So it's like, it was a very chaotic, that's the thing I want to get across, is that this offered a solution to the chaotic, relativistic, polytheistic world in which the Israelites were raised. It was no less chaotic than ours today in a postmodern relativistic world. It was full of infanticide. It was full of genocide. It was full of massive abuses of power by kings and nobles. It was full of corruption and debauchery and sexual immorality. I mean, in ancient Sumeria, in the land of Sumer, there was temple prostitution already, and this is like 2800 to 3000 BC, like before Moses even lived, like 1,000 years before Abraham. There was already temple prostitution. There was already a lot of debauchery, and it all stemmed from this chaotic understanding. Think about it from the perspective of the ancient Near Eastern people of the region. If they came from chaos, if chaos was involved in creation, if the gods wrestled with chaos and they were the fruit of chaos, why shouldn't we live how we want? Instead, God is saying, no, I am a God of order. I am a God of structure. Even in creation, I had an order of events that I did things according to my good purpose. And I did it for a particular reason, and here is the order. And I'm going to lead my people out of bondage, eventually, and all these things. Like he has a purpose to everything, both spiritual bondage and physical captivity in the case of Israel. So, there are so many references in the Bible to the creation account. Romans 4:14, I forgot about that one too. We can turn there. And we're not going to get, I can already tell we're not going to get very far into Genesis 1, but that's okay. I'm just trying to lay some groundwork, and we'll dig in some more next time. But Romans 4:14 says that, for if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void. No, that's not right. Oh, no. I got my Romans 4:14. I must have written down that wrong. Sorry. Yeah, that was wrong. I don't know where that was. Well, let's turn to, we don't have to turn, I'll just summarize. So Mark 10:5-6 says, male and female from the beginning of creation. That's where Jesus is talking about marriage. He says, from the beginning, there was male and female. Paul describes God as having existed before anything else, and he holds all creation together. I already referenced that in Colossians 1:17. The half-brother of Jesus told believers that God created all the lights in the heavens, and that's in James 1:17. And extending the creation account beyond just the Israelites was Melchizedek, who blessed Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and that's in Genesis 14:19. So the point stands, and also in Revelation 3:14, God describes the new creation, which implies something old, which had already been created. So all that being said, there is time and time again this reiteration of God creating everything. In contrast to this, the Egyptians, from which the Israelites were coming out of, there is no known single Egyptian account to date that describes the complete Egyptian perspective on creation. Instead, we have to put together kind of a mosaic of bits and pieces recorded in various documents. And the Egyptian creation myth is, pretty much purely devoted to just talking about how the gods were birthed, like where the gods came from, and as they took their forms in the creation of nature. So it's such a, it would have stood, the creation account of Moses would have stood as such a stark contrast. And this is contrary to what we would expect to find, as other people have already alluded to, from somebody who had come out of that culture. Almost inevitably, throughout human history, whenever somebody comes out of a particular culture, that culture influences them, right? I mean, I'm influenced by the culture around me, for better or worse, all the time. Our culture influences us. So the fact that Moses came out of this culture of multiple gods and a creation account that talks more about how the gods were created, or and all these other weird things that are going on, the intermarriage of the gods and stuff, we would expect that Moses would be influenced by that. But he wasn't. And I think that's actually an evidence for why the Genesis account is superior to all these other ones. Yeah, there is none. He is presupposed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. That's what I mean by that distinction of his character and his attributes from humanity. There's this distinction. I am God, you are not. Because in the Egyptian creation accounts, there was an infinite, dark, watery, chaotic sea. So an infinite, dark, water, so the water was infinite? Well, that's a contradiction. Like, matter cannot be infinite, God can be infinite, spirit can, but not water. So there's an infinite, dark, watery, chaotic sea. The gods mentioned in the Egyptian creation accounts were Nun, who existed in the primordial waters, Atum, who emerged from the waters, Enid, who was the manifestation of the creation of the material world generated by Atum, and Re, or Re Omon, the sun. Later, humanity was created by accident. At the end of the day, the creator God rested. So finally, Pharaoh was born as the firstborn of Ra. Everything was done in a single day, mostly by sneezing, spitting, and masturbation. Man was created in the image of Ra, or Knum fashioned man on a potter's wheel with the breath of God. If that God was Re, or Ra, Hecate, or Aton is unclear. Or man sprung from the eye of Atum. So there's all these conflicting, accounts, right? And they were written over hundreds of years. They were compiled in various papyri and stuff, some of which we still have today, or they're carved on, stele and reliefs and stuff. And they're mostly just nonsense like that. And they don't have any rhyme or reason to them. They're basically just they're just ancient man's attempt to form some kind of rhyme or reason to the chaos around them. And just describe chaos around them. But God, like I said before, immediately begins with order. So, let's continue in Genesis here. It says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. and the evening and the morning were the first day. Isn't it interesting that that Moses recorded a very interesting detail here. Before any kind of scientific analysis, before any kind of understanding about what light is and what it isn't, he actually claims that light is something. Isn't that interesting? That was not the case in the ancient Near East. The ancient Near Eastern perspective about light and dark is that there were forces that were not physical. That light and dark were just kind of spiritual realities. They were not something, or light was not actually something per se. But now we know that light is actually comprised of what? Photons, right? Photons, and it's a wavelength, and it's also something. It's a particle and a wavelength. And we don't really, even today, we don't truly understand it. We know it has a speed, or a velocity, I guess, I don't know, or a speed. Yeah, it has a speed. It has a speed, but we can only measure it one way. So there's all these things about light that even today, we're just now discovering in the last 100 years. But in the Genesis account, he says that light was created before any source. That light was created before there was a sun or a moon or stars or anything to emanate that source. Now, I think that's fascinating. That kind of is like, what did that look like? That's what I want to know. What did that look like? What did that look like in these primordial waters, of the earth that God is hovering over, and he says, let there be light. Suddenly there was light. And is he just holding it in stasis? Is he just holding it in place? Or is it emanating from him? Or what does it look like? I just wish we knew.
Well, it comes back to the beginning part where God created the heavens and the earth,
Mm-hmm.
but he didn't give it shape.
Yep. Right.
He created matter,
Mm-hmm.
and he gave it form.
Mm-hmm.
He created light, with the matter of light,
Mm-hmm.
and later he'll give it form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. He almost does everything in opposite of what, in order of what the other competing worldviews of the day would say. They all do things opposite to that. That's interesting. All right. And God called the light day and the dark. And then God said, in verse 6, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. Oh, geez, I'm running out of time. Okay, well, I'll wrap up. I'll wrap up there. I ran out of time. But yeah, so we'll just pick up there next time, and we might talk about some more alternative myths.